Marcus J. had always been a creature of habit, but lately, his habits had narrowed to an almost suffocating routine. Wake up at 8, make coffee that tasted like disappointment, sit at his desk pretending to work on graphic design projects that felt increasingly meaningless, and stare out the window of his third-floor apartment in what used to be a laundromat in Brooklyn. The building had been converted into artist studios and cheap apartments, but it still smelled faintly of industrial detergent and broken dreams. 30, Marcus felt like he'd aged a decade in the past year. The creative fire that had once driven him to work late into the night, experimenting with typography and color schemes that made clients gasp with delight, had flickered and died sometime around his birthday. He'd stopped returning calls from friends, stopped going to gallery openings, stopped pretending that he was anything other than a man going through the motions of a life that no longer fit him. His apartment was a testament to his current state of mind. Clean but sterile, organized but lifeless. The walls were bare except for a few pieces he'd created in better times, and even those seemed to mock him now with their vibrant colors and bold statements. Everything felt muted, as if someone had turned down the saturation on his entire existence. The view from his window wasn't much better. The courtyard below had been abandoned for years, filled with weeds and rusted metal, a forgotten space that the city had given up on. It was perfect for his mood, really desolate and ignored just like he felt most days. But on this particular Tuesday morning in late October, something was different. As Marcus sat with his coffee, laptop open to a project he'd been avoiding for 3 days, he noticed movement in the courtyard below. A man had appeared from somewhere, carrying what looked like a small wooden stool. He was tall, with warm brown skin and an easy way of moving that suggested someone comfortable in his own body. He wore a loose-fitting sweater in deep forest green and a knitted cap that looked handmade, the kind of thing that suggested someone who paid attention to details, who cared about craftsmanship. Marcus watched as the man set up his stool against the brick wall that faced the courtyard, positioning it with the kind of careful attention that suggested this wasn't a random choice. From a large canvas bag, he began pulling out what looked like yarn, needles, and various tools that Marcus couldn't identify from his third-floor perch. The man put on headphones, and even from 3 stories up, Marcus could see him swaying slightly to whatever music was playing. Then, to Marcus's amazement, the man began to knit directly onto the brick wall, using what appeared to be a combination of traditional knitting needles and larger tools that he was somehow anchoring into the mortar between the bricks. Marcus had seen guerrilla art before, had even participated in some street art projects during his more adventurous college years, but this was something entirely different. The man wasn't painting or pasting or spray painting. He was knitting, slowly and methodically, creating what looked like the beginning of a large textile installation directly onto the abandoned wall. For the first time in months, Marcus felt genuinely curious about something. He abandoned his laptop and moved closer to the window, pressing his face against the glass to get a better look. The man worked with the focused intensity of someone completely absorbed in their craft, never looking up, never seeming to notice that he had an audience. Marcus watched for 2 hours, mesmerized by the rhythmic movements of the man's hands, the gradual emergence of patterns and textures that were somehow both random and deliberate. When the man finally packed up his supplies and left, Marcus felt bereft, as if someone had turned off a television show just as it was getting interesting. That night, Marcus found himself thinking about the mysterious knitter instead of his usual litany of professional disappointments and creative blocks. Who was this man? What was he creating? Why was he doing it in an abandoned courtyard where almost no one would see it? The questions followed him into his dreams, where he found himself surrounded by walls of knitted fabric in colors he'd never seen before. The next morning, Marcus woke earlier than usual, driven by an anticipation he hadn't felt in months. He made his coffee and positioned himself at the window, waiting to see if the man would return. At 9:30, like some kind of beautiful, punctual ghost, the man appeared again with his stool and his bag of supplies. This time, Marcus was ready. He watched more carefully, trying to understand the technique, the vision behind what was clearly becoming a substantial piece of art. The man worked with the same focused intensity as the day before, but now Marcus could see that he was building on what he'd created yesterday, adding new sections that seemed to respond to and complement the existing work. As the days passed, Marcus's routine reorganized itself around the mysterious knitter's schedule. He would wake up, make coffee, and position himself at the window like a sentry, waiting for the man to appear. The knitter was remarkably consistent, arriving around 9:30 each morning and working for 2 to 3 hours before packing up and disappearing until the next day. The installation grew slowly but steadily, revealing itself to be more complex and beautiful than Marcus had initially imagined. It wasn't just a random collection of knitted fabric. It was a carefully planned composition that seemed to tell a story, though Marcus couldn't yet decipher what that story might be. There were sections that looked like cityscapes, with geometric patterns that suggested buildings and streets. Other areas were more organic, with flowing lines and natural colors that evoked landscapes or seascapes. And scattered throughout were what looked like portraits, faces emerging from the wool in subtle variations of color and texture that were somehow more expressive than any photograph. But it was on the 7th day of watching that Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold with a mixture of fear and excitement. Among the faces and patterns, he could swear he saw something that looked familiar. A small knitted hat, worked in the exact shade of blue as the one he'd worn the day before. Marcus rushed to his closet and pulled out the hat in question, holding it up to the window. The resemblance was unmistakable. The knitter had somehow observed him, had seen him wearing this specific hat, and had incorporated it into his art. But that was impossible, wasn't it? The man never looked up, never seemed to acknowledge that the windows above even existed. How could he have seen Marcus's hat? Unless Marcus spent the rest of the day in a state of confused excitement, alternating between rational explanations and wild theories. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe blue knitted hats were common enough that the similarity was meaningless. Maybe he was losing his mind from too many months of isolation and creative stagnation. But when he woke up the next morning and took his position at the window, he saw something that eliminated any possibility of coincidence. The knitter had added a new section overnight, and this time there was no mistaking what Marcus was seeing. Knitted into the wall was a pair of glasses, rendered in brown and gold wool, that were identical to the ones Marcus was wearing at that very moment. Marcus touched his own glasses, then looked back at the wall. The likeness was uncanny, down to the small chip in the left lens that he'd been meaning to get fixed for months. This couldn't be coincidence. The man was somehow seeing him, was incorporating details from Marcus's appearance into his art. As the days continued, the evidence became overwhelming. A sweater in the exact shade of gray that Marcus had worn on Tuesday. A silhouette that perfectly matched Marcus's posture as he sat at his desk. A pattern of diagonal lines that looked remarkably like the view from Marcus's window, as if seen from below. Marcus felt like he was living in a dream, or possibly a very elaborate hallucination. He considered calling his doctor, considered taking a vacation, considered moving to a different apartment. Instead, he called his best friend Terrell, who had been trying to reach him for weeks. "Dude, where have you been?" Terrell's voice was warm with concern and exasperation. "I've been calling you for like a month. Are you okay?" "I think I have a knitting stalker," Marcus said without preamble. There was a long pause. "I'm sorry, what?" Marcus told him everything. The mysterious man, the daily routine, the growing installation, the unmistakable details from his own appearance that kept showing up in the knitted artwork. "So let me get this straight," Terrell said when Marcus finished. "There's a hot guy creating art in your courtyard, and he's been watching you and incorporating you into his work? I never said he was hot. You didn't have to. I can hear it in your voice. And Marcus, dude, you sound more alive than you have in months. When was the last time you cared about anything this much?" Marcus considered this. It was true that he'd been more engaged, more present, more interested in something than he'd been since his creative block had started. But the situation was also deeply unsettling. "It's weird though, right? Like, borderline creepy. Or romantic as hell," Terrell countered. "Someone is paying such close attention to you that they're turning you into art. When was the last time anyone noticed you enough to include you in their creative process?" Marcus had to admit that Terrell had a point. He'd been feeling invisible for months, like he was disappearing a little more each day. The idea that someone had not only been seeing him but had been finding him interesting enough to memorialize in wool was both thrilling and terrifying. "What should I do?" Marcus asked. "Go talk to him, obviously. Find out what this is about. Maybe he's been waiting for you to notice. What if he's crazy? What if he's perfect for you?" After hanging up with Terrell, Marcus spent the rest of the day in a state of nervous energy. He'd been living as a passive observer for so long that the idea of taking action felt foreign and frightening. But he also couldn't ignore the fact that for the first time in months, he felt genuinely curious about something, genuinely invested in an outcome. That evening, he made a decision. Tomorrow, he would go down to the courtyard. He would introduce himself to the mysterious knitter. He would find out what was really happening and why he'd become part of someone else's art. The next morning, Marcus woke up with the kind of nervous energy he hadn't experienced since college. He changed clothes 3 times, settled on jeans and a sweater that he hoped struck the right balance between casual and put together, and then spent 20 minutes trying to work up the courage to leave his apartment. When he finally made it downstairs and around to the courtyard entrance, he found the gate unlocked and slightly ajar. The knitter was already there, sitting on his stool with his back to the entrance, working on a section of the installation that seemed to be a detailed landscape rendered in shades of green and brown. Marcus approached slowly, not wanting to startle the man or interrupt his work. Up close, the installation was even more impressive than it had appeared from his window. The level of detail was extraordinary, with tiny knitted elements that created texture and depth that would have been impossible to see from 3 stories up. The man was wearing the same forest green sweater Marcus had noticed on the first day, but now Marcus could see that it was handmade, with subtle variations in the knitting that suggested personal craftsmanship rather than mass production. His hands moved with the kind of practiced efficiency that spoke of years of experience, and the music leaking from his headphones was indeed jazz, something smooth and contemplative that seemed to match the rhythm of his work. Marcus cleared his throat softly, and the man looked up, pulling off his headphones with a smile that was both surprised and somehow not surprised at all. "I was wondering when you'd come down," the man said, his voice warm and slightly accented in a way that Marcus couldn't immediately place. "You've been watching me for weeks. I didn't think you'd noticed," Marcus said, feeling his face heat with embarrassment. "Hard not to notice someone staring at you for 3 hours every morning," the man replied, but his tone was gentle, teasing rather than accusatory.
I'm Damien Cole.
"Marcus J. I live up there." He gestured toward his window, feeling foolish for stating the obvious. "I know," Damien said, following his gaze. "3rd floor, corner apartment. You drink your coffee from a blue mug. You favor your left hand when you're thinking, and you haven't been sleeping well lately." Marcus stared at him. "How could you possibly know that?" "Body language," Damien said simply. "Posture, gestures, the way you hold yourself. I used to be a sculptor before this. You learn to read people when you're trying to capture something essential about them." "Used to be." Damien's expression shifted slightly, becoming more guarded. "I worked in galleries for about 10 years. Traditional sculpture, mostly bronze and stone. But after my father died last year, I couldn't. The indoor spaces felt suffocating. The art world felt hollow. So I started this." He gestured toward the wall. "Knitting was something my father taught me when I was young. It became a way to process grief, to create something healing instead of just decorative." Marcus looked at the installation with new understanding. "Is that what this is? Healing?" "Among other things." Damien stood up, stretching muscles that had been held in the same position for hours. "It's also about connection, about seeing and being seen, about finding beauty in abandoned places. And I'm part of it?" Damien smiled, and Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a warmth he hadn't experienced in months. "You're the reason I chose this location. I saw you in your window that first day and you looked so isolated, so disconnected from the world around you. I thought maybe if I created something beautiful enough, you might remember that beauty exists." Marcus felt tears prick at his eyes. "I haven't been. I've been going through a difficult time." "I know," Damien said gently. "I could see it in the way you held yourself, The way you stared at your computer screen like it was an enemy. That's why I started including you in the work. I wanted you to see yourself the way I see you. Which is how? Like someone worth paying attention to. Like someone who deserves to be seen. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both looking at the installation that had brought them together. Marcus could see himself reflected in the knitted images. Not just his physical appearance, but somehow his essence, his struggles, his gradual emergence from isolation. Would you like to help? Damien asked suddenly. I mean, if you have time, I could teach you some basic techniques. Marcus looked at his hands, soft from months of keyboard work and creative avoidance. I don't know anything about knitting. That's okay. This isn't really about knitting anyway. It's about paying attention, about being present, about creating something that matters. What makes you think I want to create something that matters? Damien smiled again, and Marcus realized he was quickly becoming addicted to that expression. Because you've been watching me do it for 3 weeks. Because you came down here instead of staying safely in your window. Because you're still here, even though this is probably the weirdest situation you've ever encountered. Marcus had to admit that Damien had a point. He looked at the installation again, at the faces and patterns and landscapes that seemed to tell stories he was only beginning to understand. What would I do? Whatever feels right. There's no wrong way to contribute to something like this. Marcus spent the next 2 hours learning the basics of knitting from Damien, his hands clumsy at first but gradually finding the rhythm. Damien was a patient teacher, guiding Marcus's fingers through the motions while maintaining a steady stream of conversation about art, life, and the strange ways that people found each other. I haven't felt this engaged with anything in months, Marcus admitted as he worked on a simple section of blue and gray that Damien had designated as his starting point. What happened? Damien asked. I mean, if you want to talk about it. Marcus found himself telling Damien about his creative block, his growing sense of isolation, his fear that he'd lost whatever spark had made him good at his work. Damien listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions that helped Marcus articulate feelings he'd been carrying alone for too long. It sounds like you've been trying to create from a place of emptiness, Damien said when Marcus finished. That's impossible. Art comes from connection, from seeing and being seen, from having something to say about the world. And you think I have something to say? I think you've been hiding from your own voice for so long that you've forgotten what it sounds like. But it's still there. As the days passed, Marcus found himself looking forward to his morning sessions in the courtyard with an intensity that surprised him. He would wake up early, make coffee for both himself and Damien, and spend hours working on the installation while they talked about everything and nothing. Damien was unlike anyone Marcus had ever met. He was thoughtful without being pretentious, creative without being chaotic, deeply empathetic without being overwhelming. He had a way of asking questions that made Marcus think about his own life differently, and he shared stories about his own struggles with art and identity that made Marcus feel less alone in his creative crisis. The installation continued to grow, becoming more complex and beautiful with each passing day. Marcus's contributions were small but meaningful, and he found that the meditative rhythm of knitting was helping him process emotions he'd been suppressing for months. His hands, which had felt stiff and unresponsive at his computer, came alive when working with wool and needles. You're a natural at this, Damien said one morning as Marcus worked on a section that depicted the view from his apartment window. Your tension is perfect, and you have good instincts for color. It's different from what I usually do, Marcus replied. More forgiving, somehow. With graphic design, everything has to be perfect, pixel perfect. But with this, imperfections become part of the character. That's what I love about fiber arts, Damien agreed. The human element is part of the beauty. You can't remove the maker from the work. As they worked together, Marcus began to notice details about Damien that he'd missed during his window observations. The way Damien's eyes crinkled when he laughed. The small scar on his left hand from what he'd explained was a childhood accident with a carving knife. The way he hummed along to his jazz music when he thought no one was listening. Marcus also began to notice the way Damien looked at him, with attention and interest that made him feel seen in a way he'd never experienced before. It was more than just being watched. It was being understood, being appreciated for qualities he'd never recognized in himself. One morning, Marcus arrived at the courtyard to find a small package waiting for him beside Damien's usual stool. Inside was a knitted hat in a complex pattern of blues and grays that seemed to shift and change as he moved it in the light. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made specifically for his head. "How did you know my exact size?" Marcus asked when Damien arrived a few minutes later. "I'm good at estimating," Damien said with a mysterious smile. "Do you like it?" "It's incredible. I've never owned anything this beautiful." Marcus touched the hat gently, marveling at the intricate pattern and perfect craftsmanship. "There's something in the pocket," Damien said, suddenly shy. Marcus explored the hat and found a small interior pocket he'd missed. Inside was a folded piece of paper with a message written in Damien's careful handwriting. "You watch, but you don't see yourself yet. This is how you look to me. Complex, beautiful, worthy of attention." Marcus read the note twice, feeling his chest tighten with emotion. "Damien, you don't have to say anything," Damien said quickly. "I just wanted you to know." But Marcus did want to say something. He wanted to explain how much the past few weeks had meant to him, how Damien's presence had pulled him out of the darkest period of his adult life, how being seen and appreciated had given him permission to start seeing himself differently. Instead, he said, "Thank you. For the hat, for the note, for all of this." That night, Marcus picked up his sketchbook for the first time in months. He'd been so focused on digital design that he'd forgotten the simple pleasure of drawing by hand, of letting his mind wander across paper without predetermined outcomes. He found himself drawing Damien, not trying to create a perfect likeness, but attempting to capture something essential about the man who had become such an important part of his daily life. The way Damien held his needles, the concentration on his face when he was working out a complex pattern, the gentle smile he wore when he was explaining something new to Marcus. The drawings weren't perfect, but they were alive in a way that Marcus's work hadn't been in months. They had energy and emotion and a sense of purpose that reminded him why he'd become an artist in the first place. Over the next few days, Marcus filled page after page with sketches of Damien, of the installation, of the courtyard that had become their shared creative space. He didn't show the drawings to Damien, not yet, but he brought his sketchbook with him to their morning sessions and worked on it during breaks from knitting. "You're drawing again," Damien observed one morning, noticing the sketchbook beside Marcus's knitting supplies. "A little," Marcus admitted. "It feels good to work with my hands in a different way." "Can I see?" Marcus hesitated, then opened the sketchbook to a page that showed Damien working on the installation, his face a study in concentration and contentment. Damien studied the drawing carefully, his expression unreadable. "This is how you see me?" he asked finally. "It's how you look when you're creating something," Marcus said. "Completely absorbed, completely present." "You've captured something I didn't know I was projecting," Damien said softly. "I look happy. You are happy. When you're working on this, you're the happiest person I've ever seen." Damien looked at him with an expression Marcus couldn't quite read. "I'm happy because you're here, because instead of watching from your window, you decided to be part of the story." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that neither of them seemed quite ready to address directly. Marcus felt his heart racing, felt the familiar flutter of attraction and possibility that he'd been trying to ignore for weeks. "Damien," he began, not sure what he wanted to say. "I know," Damien said quietly. "I feel it too." They worked in charged silence for the rest of the morning, both of them hyper-aware of the other's presence, of the way their hands occasionally brushed as they reached for supplies, of the way their conversation had shifted from friendly to something more intimate and complex. That afternoon, Marcus found himself unable to concentrate on anything. He'd been commissioned to design a logo for a local restaurant, work that should have been straightforward, but he kept finding himself distracted by thoughts of Damien, by the memory of their conversation, by the growing awareness that what he was feeling was definitely more than friendship. The problem was that he had no idea how to navigate the situation. He'd never been good at reading romantic signals, and Damien's attention could easily be explained by artistic interest rather than personal attraction. The last thing Marcus wanted was to misinterpret the situation and ruin the friendship that had become so important to him. That evening, he called Terrell again, needing to talk through his confusion with someone who knew him well enough to offer honest advice. "So let me get this straight," Terrell said after Marcus explained the situation. "You've been spending every morning with this guy for weeks. He's been creating art that includes you. He made you a personal gift, and he told you he's happy because you're there. And you're wondering if he might be interested in you romantically. When you put it like that, it sounds obvious. Because it is obvious. Marcus, this guy is courting you through fiber arts. It's the most romantic thing I've ever heard. But what if I'm wrong? What if I'm reading too much into it? Then you'll have an awkward conversation and move on. But what if you're right? What if this is the beginning of something amazing and you're too scared to find out?" Marcus knew Terrell was right, but knowing it and acting on it were two different things. He'd been living in a state of emotional numbness for so long that the intensity of his feelings for Damien was overwhelming. He wasn't sure he was ready for the vulnerability that came with admitting his attraction to someone he'd come to care about so deeply. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the courtyard to find Damien already there. But something was different. Instead of working on his usual section of the installation, Damien was standing back, looking at the wall with an expression of satisfaction and completion. "Is it finished?" Marcus asked, approaching to stand beside him. "This section is," Damien replied. "I wanted to complete the central panel before moving on to the next phase." Marcus looked at the wall and gasped. The central panel, which had been growing slowly over the past few weeks, was now complete, and it was breathtaking. It was a portrait. Not just any portrait, but Marcus's face, rendered in wool with a level of detail and artistry that took his breath away. But it wasn't just the technical skill that stunned him. It was the expression Damien had captured, the way he'd somehow knitted hope and possibility into Marcus's features. The Marcus in the portrait was smiling, but it was a smile Marcus didn't recognize, one that suggested confidence and joy that he hadn't felt in months. "That's how you see me?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's how you look when you're working on something you care about," Damien replied. "That's how you look when you're engaged with the world instead of hiding from it." Marcus studied the portrait, seeing himself reflected in Damien's artistry. The man in the wool was attractive, confident, worthy of attention and care. It was a version of himself he'd forgotten existed. "I haven't looked like that in months," he said. "You've been looking like that every morning for weeks," Damien corrected gently. "You just haven't been seeing it." Marcus felt tears gathering in his eyes. He'd been so focused on his own perceived failures and shortcomings that he'd missed the fact that someone else was seeing beauty in him, was finding him interesting enough to immortalize in art. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "You don't have to say anything," Damien said. "I just wanted you to see yourself the way I see you." But Marcus did want to say something. He wanted to tell Damien how much the past few weeks had meant to him, how being seen and appreciated had begun to heal parts of himself he'd thought were permanently damaged. He wanted to admit that he'd been falling for Damien slowly and steadily, that his feelings had grown from curiosity to friendship to something much deeper and more complex. Instead, he said, "I'm scared." "Of what?" "Of being seen, of being known, of caring about someone and having them realize I'm not worth the effort." Damien turned to face him fully, his expression serious and gentle. "Marcus, I've been watching you for weeks. I've seen you at your most isolated and your most engaged. I've seen you struggle and grow and find your way back to creativity. You're absolutely worth the effort." "You don't know me very well," Marcus said weakly. "I know you well enough to fall in love with you," Damien replied quietly. The words hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable and terrifying in their simplicity. Marcus felt his heart stop, felt the world narrow to just the two of them standing in an abandoned courtyard surrounded by wool and hope and the possibility of something beautiful. "You love me?" Marcus asked, needing to hear it again. "I love you," Damien confirmed. "I love your curiosity, your kindness, your willingness to try something new even when you're scared. I love the way you see the world when you're not hiding from it." Marcus looked at Damien, really looked at him, seeing not just the attractive man who had been creating art in his courtyard, but someone who had been patient and generous and caring, someone who had seen potential in Marcus when Marcus couldn't see it in himself. "I love you too," Marcus said, the words feeling both terrifying and inevitable. "I didn't know that's what this was, but I love you too." Damien smiled, the kind of smile that transforms a face completely, and Marcus felt something shift inside him, a door opening that had been closed for too long. "So what happens now?" Marcus asked. "Now we see what we can build together," Damien replied, reaching for Marcus's hand. "If you want to." Marcus looked at their joined hands, at the portrait of himself smiling from the wall, at the man who had seen him when he thought he was invisible. "I want to," he said, and meant it completely. They kissed there in the courtyard, surrounded by the art they'd created together, and Marcus felt like he was finally, truly awake for the first time in months. It was gentle and sweet and tasted like possibility, like the beginning of something that could change everything. When they broke apart, both breathing slightly harder, Damien rested his forehead against Marcus's. "I have a confession," he said. "I've been hoping you'd come down here since the first day I saw you in your window." "Really? Really? You looked so alone up there. And I thought maybe if I created something beautiful enough, you might remember that you weren't as invisible as you felt." Marcus felt tears prick at his eyes again. "You saved me," he said quietly. "I was disappearing, and you saw me. We saved each other," Damien corrected. "I was stuck too, before you gave me a reason to create something meaningful." As autumn turned to winter, Marcus and Damien's relationship deepened and evolved. They spent their mornings working on the installation, which had grown to cover most of the courtyard wall and had begun attracting attention from other neighbors and passers-by. Their afternoons were spent in Damien's apartment, a cozy space filled with yarn and books and the kind of comfortable chaos that comes from someone who creates with their hands. Marcus learned that Damien was an excellent cook, that he read voraciously, that he had a collection of jazz records that he'd inherited from his father. Damien learned that Marcus was funnier than he'd initially appeared, that he had strong opinions about typography, that he could be surprisingly romantic when he felt safe enough to be vulnerable. "I want to show you something," Marcus said one evening as they sat on Damien's couch. Marcus sketching while Damien worked on a new project. He opened his sketchbook to a page he'd been working on for weeks, a detailed drawing of Damien's hands as they knitted, surrounded by smaller sketches of needles, yarn, and the textures of various stitches. "You've been drawing my hands," Damien said, studying the page carefully. "They're beautiful," Marcus said simply. "They create beautiful things." Damien looked at him with an expression of such tenderness that Marcus felt his chest tighten with emotion. "I want to collaborate with you on something," Damien said suddenly. "Not just the installation, but something new. Something that combines your visual skills with my fiber work." "What did you have in mind?" "I don't know yet, but I think we could create something neither of us could make alone." They spent the next several weeks brainstorming, sketching, and experimenting with ways to combine their different artistic approaches. The result was a series of mixed media pieces that incorporated Marcus's graphic design skills with Damien's knitting, creating works that were both visually striking and tactily engaging. "We should show these," Marcus said one evening as they looked at their completed pieces spread across Damien's living room floor. "People should see what we've made together." "You think they're good enough?" "I think they're amazing. I think they tell a story about connection and creativity that people need to hear." Damien smiled, and Marcus realized that this was what happiness looked like. Not constant joy, but the deep satisfaction of creating something meaningful with someone you loved. They found a small gallery in their neighborhood that was willing to display their collaborative work, and the opening reception was attended by friends, neighbors, and strangers who had been drawn by the unique combination of traditional fiber arts and contemporary design. "Tell us about your process," a local art blogger asked them as they stood beside their displayed work. "We start with conversation," Marcus explained. "We talk about what we want to express, and then we find ways to combine our different skills to make it happen. It's about seeing each other clearly," Damien added, "understanding what the other person brings to the collaboration and finding ways to make those different strengths complement each other. Like a relationship," the blogger observed. Exactly like a relationship, Marcus agreed, smiling at Damien. After the reception, they walked home through their neighborhood, holding hands and talking about the evening, about the people who had responded to their work, about the possibilities that lay ahead. I have something for you, Damien said when they reached Marcus's building. What's the occasion?
Nos occasions.
I just wanted to make you something. He handed Marcus a small wrapped package, and when Marcus opened it, he found a knitted scarf in complex shades of blue and gray that seemed to shift and change in the light. It matches the hat you made me, Marcus said, wrapping the scarf around his neck. I wanted you to have a complete set, Damien said. Something that would keep you warm when I'm not there. Marcus looked at Damien, at this man who had seen him when he thought he was invisible, who had pulled him out of isolation and into creativity, who had loved him patiently and completely. Move in with me, Marcus said suddenly. What? Move in with me. I know it's fast, but I don't want to spend any more time apart than we have to. I want to wake up next to you every morning. Damien stared at him for a long moment, then broke into the kind of smile that lit up his entire face. Yes, he said simply. Yes, absolutely yes. They moved in together at the beginning of spring, combining their lives with the same careful attention they brought to their art. Marcus's sterile apartment was transformed by Damien's warmth and creativity, filled with plants and color and the tools of their respective trades. I love waking up and seeing you there, Marcus said one morning as they had coffee on the small balcony that overlooked the courtyard where their love story had begun. I love that you're not watching me from a window anymore, Damien replied. I love that you're here, part of the story instead of observing it. What's our next project? Marcus asked, looking at the installation that was still growing on the courtyard wall. I was thinking we could start a business, Damien said. Custom design work that combines your graphic skills with my fiber arts. We could create everything from logos to art installations for people who want something unique. Seriously, I think we work well together. I think we could build something beautiful. Marcus looked at Damien, at the man who had saved him from his own isolation, who had seen beauty in him when he couldn't see it himself, who had loved him into becoming a better version of himself. I think we already have, he said, and kissed Damien there on their balcony, surrounded by the morning light and the promise of everything they would create together. A year later, their design business had grown beyond their wildest expectations. They'd created installations for galleries, logos for small businesses, and custom pieces for clients who wanted something that couldn't be found anywhere else. Their work was featured in design magazines and art blogs, and they'd been invited to teach workshops on collaborative creativity. But the success, while gratifying, wasn't the most important thing. The most important thing was the life they'd built together, the way they'd learned to see each other clearly and completely, the way they'd created something beautiful out of loneliness and isolation. Do you ever miss it? Marcus asked one evening as they worked together in their shared studio, now a converted space in their building's basement. The solitude, the independence, the simplicity of working alone? Never, Damien said without hesitation. Everything I create is better because you're part of it. Everything I am is better because you see me. Marcus looked at Damien, still amazed by the fact that this man loved him, still grateful for the day he decided to come down from his window and be part of the story instead of just watching it unfold. I love you, he said, the words as true now as they'd been the first time he'd spoken them in the courtyard. I love you too, Damien replied. Thank you for letting me see you. Outside their window, the installation on the courtyard wall continued to grow, now maintained by other artists who had been inspired by their work. People would stop to look at it as they passed, to find meaning in the colors and patterns and faces that emerged from the wool. And sometimes, if they looked closely enough, they could see the portrait of a man smiling, knitted in shades of hope and possibility, a reminder that beauty wasn't found in perfection but in being seen, truly seen, by someone who loved you enough to make you part of their art. The installation had become a neighborhood landmark, a symbol of connection and creativity that had grown from the simple act of one person seeing another and deciding that what they saw was worth preserving in wool and time. And in the apartment above, two men continued to create together, to see each other clearly, to build something beautiful from the patient, daily work of love. 5 years had passed since Marcus first spotted Damien knitting in the courtyard, and their lives had evolved in ways neither of them could have imagined during those early days of tentative friendship and growing attraction. Their design business, Fiber and Form, had become one of the most sought-after creative partnerships in Brooklyn, known for their unique ability to blend traditional crafts with contemporary aesthetics. Their client roster now included major brands, art institutions, and private collectors who wanted pieces that couldn't be found anywhere else. They'd been featured on the cover of Design Quarterly, had given a TED Talk about collaborative creativity, and had just returned from a month-long residency in Japan where they'd studied traditional textile techniques with master craftsmen. But success, Marcus had learned, brought its own set of challenges. The quiet intimacy of their early work together had been replaced by a demanding schedule of client meetings, gallery openings, and speaking engagements. They were busier than they'd ever been, more financially secure than Marcus had ever dreamed possible, and sometimes felt like they barely had time to breathe, let alone maintain the careful attention to each other that had formed the foundation of their relationship. "We need to talk," Damien said one evening as they sat in their expanded studio, surrounded by half-finished projects and the detritus of a day spent trying to meet impossible deadlines. Marcus looked up from his laptop, where he'd been responding to emails from potential clients, each one more demanding than the last. "About what?" "About us. About this." Damien gestured around the studio, which had once felt like a sanctuary, but now sometimes felt more like a prison. "About whether we're still creating because we love it or because we have to." Marcus closed his laptop and really looked at Damien for the first time in what felt like weeks. His partner looked tired, stressed in a way that was becoming too familiar. "You're not happy." "I'm happy with you," Damien said carefully. "I'm happy with our life together. But I'm not sure I'm happy with what our work has become." "What do you mean?" Damien set down the knitting needles he'd been holding, a project for a high-end fashion brand that wanted a fiber art installation for their flagship store. "Do you remember the first piece we made together? The one that combined your sketches with my knitting?" "Of course." "Do you remember why we made it?" Marcus thought back to those early days when they'd been driven by curiosity and connection rather than contracts and deadlines. "Because we wanted to see what would happen when we combined our different ways of seeing the world." "Exactly. We made it because we had something to say, something we wanted to explore together." "When was the last time we created something like that?" Marcus considered the question and realized he couldn't remember. Their recent work, while technically excellent and financially rewarding, had been driven by client needs rather than personal inspiration. They'd become so good at their collaborative process that they could produce beautiful work almost automatically, but somewhere along the way, they'd lost the sense of discovery that had made their early partnership so exciting. "I don't know," Marcus admitted. "Too long." "I miss it," Damien said quietly. "I miss the feeling of not knowing what we were going to create until we created it. I miss working on something just because it excited us." "So what do you want to do?" "I want to take a break. Not from each other, but from the business side of things. I want to spend some time creating without deadlines, without clients, without any goal other than exploring what we can make together." Marcus felt a flutter of panic at the thought of turning down work, of potentially damaging the reputation they'd built so carefully. But he also felt something else, relief. The idea of returning to the kind of experimental, intimate creativity that had characterized their early relationship was incredibly appealing. "For how long?" "I don't know. A few months? Until we remember why we started doing this in the first place." Marcus looked around their studio, at the organized chaos of a successful creative partnership, at the evidence of everything they'd built together. Then he looked at Damien, at the man who had saved him from creative isolation and taught him what it meant to be truly seen by another person. "Okay," he said. "Let's do it." They spent the next 2 weeks finishing their existing commitments and gracefully declining new projects, explaining to clients that they were taking a temporary hiatus to work on personal projects. Some understood. Others were frustrated or confused. But Marcus found that he didn't care as much as he'd expected about disappointing people who saw them primarily as service providers rather than artists. "It feels weird," Marcus said on their first official day of creative freedom, as they sat in their studio with no pressing deadlines for the first time in years. I keep waiting for someone to call with an emergency project. I disconnected the business phone, Damien said with a grin. For the next 3 months, we only exist as artists, not as Fiber and Form LLC. So what do we make first? I have an idea, Damien said, pulling out a sketchbook that Marcus hadn't seen before. I've been thinking about our origin story, about the installation in the courtyard, about the way you used to watch me from your window. He opened the sketchbook to reveal drawings of windows, dozens of them, rendered in different styles and from different perspectives. Some were realistic architectural studies, others were more abstract interpretations of the concept of viewing and being viewed. I want to create a series about windows, Damien continued, about the ways we see each other, the barriers and connections between inside and outside, public and private, observer and observed. Marcus studied the sketches, feeling the familiar flutter of excitement that came with encountering a genuinely compelling artistic concept. This is beautiful. How would we execute it? That's what I want to figure out with you. Maybe fiber installations that can be viewed from both sides? Maybe incorporating your graphic work with transparent materials? I don't know yet, but I want to explore it together. They spent the next several days brainstorming, sketching, and experimenting with materials. It was the kind of open-ended exploration they hadn't allowed themselves in years, and Marcus was amazed by how energizing it felt to work without a predetermined outcome. What if we created actual windows? Marcus suggested during one of their brainstorming sessions. Not just representations of windows, but functional pieces that people could look through that would change depending on the viewer's perspective? Like interactive installations? Exactly. Windows that tell different stories depending on which side you're viewing from. Damien's eyes lit up with the kind of enthusiasm Marcus remembered from their early collaborations. That's brilliant. We could create a whole series, each one exploring a different aspect of observation and connection. They spent the next month creating their first piece, a large window frame that Damien constructed from reclaimed wood and then covered with a complex knitted screen that Marcus had designed to create different visual effects depending on the lighting and viewing angle. When viewed from one side, the screen showed abstract patterns in muted colors. From the other side, the same patterns resolved into a portrait of two figures reaching toward each other. It's like a visual metaphor for our relationship, Marcus said as they tested the piece in different lighting conditions. From one perspective, you see the individual elements. From another, you see the connection. That's exactly what I was hoping for, Damien replied, adjusting the hanging system they devised to allow viewers to walk around the piece. Art that changes based on how you approach it. They created 5 more pieces in the series, each one exploring a different aspect of seeing and being seen. There was a piece about urban loneliness that showed bustling city scenes from one side and empty rooms from the other. Another explored the concept of home by depicting the same interior space at different times of day and seasons. The final piece in the series was the most personal, a large installation that recreated the view from Marcus's original apartment window. From one side, viewers saw Damien working on his courtyard installation, rendered in precise detail through a combination of knitted elements and Marcus's photorealistic illustration work. From the other side, they saw Marcus at his window, watching, with an expression of longing and curiosity that captured exactly how he'd felt during those early days of observing Damien from afar. "This is us," Marcus said when they finished the piece. "This is our story." "It's everyone's story in a way," Damien replied. "The desire to connect, the fear of being vulnerable, the moment when you decide to step out from behind the glass and become part of someone else's world." When the series was complete, they faced a decision about what to do with it. They could approach galleries, could market it through their existing professional networks, could turn it into another business opportunity. Instead, they decided to display it in their neighborhood, in the same community where their love story had begun. They approached the owner of a small gallery space that had recently opened on their street, a woman named Elena who had been following their work for years. When they explained the project and their desire to show it locally rather than pursuing more prestigious venues, she was immediately enthusiastic. This is exactly the kind of work our neighborhood needs to see, Elena said as they walked through the pieces in their studio. Art that speaks to real human experience, that comes from authentic connection rather than commercial calculation. The opening reception was unlike any professional event they'd attended in years. Instead of industry professionals and collectors, the gallery was filled with neighbors, friends, and community members who had watched their relationship develop over the years. The courtyard installation was visible through the gallery's front windows, creating a visual connection between their current work and the art that had brought them together. "Tell us about this piece," asked Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly woman who lived in the building next to theirs, and who had been one of the first people to notice and appreciate Damien's original courtyard installation. Marcus and Damien stood beside the final piece in the series, the one that depicted their origin story, and Marcus found himself telling the story of how they'd met, how Damien had seen him when he felt invisible, how art had become the bridge between isolation and connection. "It's a love story," Mrs. Rodriguez said when he finished, her eyes bright with understanding. "It's a love story," Damien agreed, "but it's also about the courage it takes to be vulnerable, to let yourself be seen by another person." After the reception, Marcus and Damien walked home through their neighborhood, holding hands and talking about the evening, about the way their neighbors had responded to the work, about the satisfaction of creating something meaningful rather than just marketable. "I want to keep doing this," Marcus said as they paused outside their building. "Not exclusively, but I want to make sure we always have room in our lives for work that comes from our relationship rather than our business." "Agreed," Damien said. "I think we lost sight of that for a while. We got so focused on success that we forgot why we wanted to succeed in the first place. Which was to have the freedom to create together, to build a life that honored both our individual talents and our partnership." They made a pact that night to always maintain space for personal projects, to never let their commercial success eclipse the intimate creative partnership that had brought them together. It was a commitment that would be tested many times over the years as opportunities arose and demands increased, but it became the foundation for a sustainable creative life that honored both their artistic ambitions and their relationship. The Windows series led to other personal projects, each one deepening their understanding of their own creative process and their connection to each other. They created a series about time, using techniques that allowed textile pieces to change color and texture as they aged. They developed a line of collaborative works that could only be completed when two people worked on them simultaneously, requiring cooperation and communication in ways that most art didn't. Their most ambitious personal project came 3 years later, when they decided to create a permanent installation in their own neighborhood. Working with local community organizations, they designed and executed a large-scale public art piece that wrapped around an entire city block, telling the story of the neighborhood through fiber and graphic elements that had been contributed by residents. "This is what I want our legacy to be," Damien said as they stood back to look at the completed installation, which had taken over a year to plan and execute. Not just beautiful objects, but art that brings people together, that makes communities stronger. "It's perfect," Marcus agreed, watching children run along the base of the installation, tracing patterns with their fingers and discovering new details in the complex composition. "It's everything I hoped art could be when I first started creating." Their relationship had evolved too, deepening and stabilizing in ways that had surprised them both. They'd learned to navigate the challenges of working together while living together, developing systems and boundaries that protected both their professional collaboration and their personal intimacy. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't come down to the courtyard that day?" Damien asked one evening as they worked together in their studio, now expanded to include a small gallery space where they showed both their own work and pieces by other local artists. "Never," Marcus replied without hesitation. "I might wonder about the details, about how things might have unfolded differently, but I never wonder about the fundamental outcome. We were always going to find each other." "How can you be so certain?" "Because you saw me when I couldn't see myself. Because I needed exactly what you were offering, and you needed exactly what I was able to give. Because sometimes the universe arranges things perfectly, and all we have to do is be brave enough to participate." Damien smiled, the expression Marcus had fallen in love with years ago and that still had the power to make his heart skip. "I love your romantic optimism," I love your patient realism, Marcus replied. I love the way you see beauty in process, not just outcomes. I love the way you taught me that creating together is better than creating alone. They were interrupted by a knock on their studio door, and Marcus opened it to find a young man, probably in his early 20s, holding a sketchbook and looking nervous. I'm sorry to bother you, the young man said. I'm Jamie. I live in the building across the street. I've been watching you work through your window for months, and I was wondering, would you maybe be willing to give me some advice about collaborative art? Marcus and Damien exchanged glances, both of them recognizing the echo of their own story in this young artist's request. Of course, Damien said warmly. Come in. Tell us what you're working on. Jamie explained that he was a photographer who had been wanting to collaborate with his boyfriend, a musician, but they weren't sure how to combine their different artistic mediums. As he talked, Marcus found himself remembering his own early uncertainty about creative collaboration, his fear that working with someone else would compromise his individual artistic vision. The most important thing, Marcus told Jamie, is to approach collaboration as a conversation rather than a compromise. You're not trying to find the middle ground between your two approaches. You're trying to create something new that incorporates the best of both. And you have to be willing to be surprised, Damien added. Some of our best work has come from moments when we let go of our preconceptions and allowed the process to lead us somewhere unexpected. They spent an hour talking with Jamie about the practical and emotional aspects of creative partnership, sharing stories from their own experience and offering encouragement for his artistic experiments. After Jamie left, Marcus realized that mentoring younger artists had become an important part of their practice, a way of giving back to the community that had supported their own development. We should formalize this, he said to Damien. Maybe offer workshops or mentorship programs for artists who want to explore collaboration. I'd love that, Damien replied. There's something beautiful about passing on what we've learned, about helping other people find their own ways of creating together. They developed a series of workshops that they offered through local arts organizations, teaching techniques for creative collaboration that went beyond just the technical aspects to include communication skills, conflict resolution, and the emotional intelligence required for successful artistic partnerships. What we're really teaching, Marcus realized during one of their workshops, is how to see each other clearly, how to appreciate differences instead of being threatened by them, how to build something together that's stronger than what either person could create alone. It's like relationship counseling disguised as art instruction, Damien said with a laugh. Which makes sense, since our art has always been about our relationship. Their teaching work led to other opportunities. Guest lectures at art schools, articles in professional journals, invitations to speak at conferences about creativity and partnership. But they were careful to maintain the boundaries they'd established, never allowing their public profile to overshadow their private creative practice. The work comes first had become their motto. Everything else is secondary. By their 10th anniversary, Marcus and Damien had built a life that honored both their individual artistic visions and their shared commitment to creating meaningful work together. They had maintained their collaborative practice while also developing separate projects that allowed them to explore their own interests and growth. Marcus had returned to pure graphic design with a series of limited edition art books that combined his visual work with poetry by local writers. Damien had begun creating large-scale sculptures that incorporated traditional knitting techniques with unconventional materials like metal wire and recycled plastic. I love that we can support each other's individual work while still maintaining our partnership, Marcus said as they prepared for a double exhibition that would show both their collaborative pieces and their separate projects side by side. It's taken us a long time to figure out how to do that, Damien replied. To understand that love doesn't mean losing yourself in another person, but rather finding ways to be fully yourself while also being part of something larger. The anniversary exhibition was held in the same gallery where they'd shown their Windows series, and it felt like coming full circle. The space was filled with a decade's worth of creative evolution, showing how their work had grown more sophisticated and ambitious, while never losing the intimate quality that had characterized their earliest collaborations. "What's next?" asked a journalist who was covering the exhibition for a local arts magazine. Marcus and Damien looked at each other, sharing one of those wordless communications that had become second nature after years of creative partnership. "We don't know," Damien said honestly. And that's the most exciting part. After 10 years, we're still discovering new ways to surprise each other, new territories to explore together. The only thing we know for certain, Marcus added, is that we'll keep creating, keep seeing each other clearly, keep building something beautiful from the daily practice of love and attention. As the evening wound down and the last guests departed, Marcus and Damien found themselves alone in the gallery, surrounded by a decade's worth of shared creative life. The original courtyard installation was visible through the gallery windows, now maintained by a collective of local artists, but still anchored by the portrait of Marcus that Damien had knitted all those years ago. "Do you remember what you wrote in that first note?" Marcus asked, looking at a display case that contained some of their early collaborative sketches and the hat that Damien had made for him during their first weeks of friendship. "You watch, but you don't see yourself yet," Damien quoted. "This is how you look to me. Complex, beautiful, worthy of attention. Do you still see me that way?" "I see you more clearly now," Damien replied. "I see all the ways you've grown, all the courage you've developed, all the beauty you've learned to recognize in yourself. But yes, I still see that complexity, that worthiness of attention. If anything, I see it more clearly." "I see you more clearly too," Marcus said. "I see how your patience and generosity have shaped not just our work, but our entire community. I see how your way of paying attention has taught so many people to see beauty they might have missed." They walked home together through the neighborhood that had become so much more than just the place where they lived. It was the community they'd helped to shape through their art and their teaching, the context that had nurtured their relationship and their creative practice, the foundation for whatever they would build together in the years to come. "I love you," Marcus said as they climbed the stairs to their apartment, passing the window where he'd first spotted Damien working in the courtyard. "I love you too," Damien replied. "Thank you for coming down from your window. Thank you for being brave enough to be part of the story instead of just watching it happen." "Thank you for seeing me," Marcus said. "Thank you for showing me that being seen doesn't have to be scary, that it can be the beginning of something beautiful." In their apartment, surrounded by the accumulated artifacts of a decade of shared creative life, they continued the conversation that had started with a knitted hat and a note about being worthy of attention. It was a conversation that would continue for the rest of their lives, expressed through art and words and the daily choices that built a love story worth preserving in wool and time. Outside their window, the courtyard installation glowed softly in the evening light, a testament to the power of one person seeing another and deciding that what they saw was worth celebrating, worth preserving, worth building a life around. And in the apartment above, two men who had found each other through the patient practice of attention continued to create together, to see each other clearly, to weave their individual stories into something larger and more beautiful than either could have imagined alone. The installation would outlast them, as would the community of artists and neighbors whose lives had been touched by their example of creative partnership. But the most important legacy wasn't the art they'd created or the businesses they'd built or the students they'd taught. It was the proof they'd offered that love and attention could transform isolation into connection, that two people could see each other clearly and build something beautiful from that seeing, that the daily practice of creative collaboration could be a form of love that changed not just the artists involved but everyone who witnessed their example. In the end, their love story had become more than just the romance between two men who'd found each other through art. It had become a testament to the power of creativity to build community, to the importance of seeing and being seen, to the way that patient attention and generous love could transform not just individual lives but entire neighborhoods. And it all began with a man at a window, watching another man knit beauty into an abandoned courtyard, and finding the courage to become part of the story instead of just observing it from afar.